Yeah, so since it's been a little while, we'll start with a quick round of introductions. My name is Alana McKeeman. I'll be the facilitator for this evening. I'm also on the consultant team. Do you want to start here?
I'm Jerry Dawson. I'm the Transportation Chairman of the Montgomery County Civic Federation and have been involved in the transportation project for about 40 years. And transportation traffic seems to be getting worse and worse over the years. I don't know why.
I'm Peter Benjamin. I'm the former chair of the Metro Board and also the former mayor of the town of Garrett Park.
Zach Drummond, Government Affairs, the Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors.
Francine Waters, Transportation Demand Management Specialist.
Arnold Cowan, a retired lawyer who used to, well, first of all, I represent the Montgomery County, the Bethesda Chevy Chase Chamber of Commerce. But I used to be very heavily involved in the white flint sector, but lately, with my retirement, I haven't, I'm still very much used on it.
Great.
I'm Corey Pitts. I'm the project manager with MCDOT on this project.
Christine Pataki, transportation designer on this project.
I'm Dan Lewis. I'm one of the transportation engineers in the consultant team.
Denny Farron, also one of the transportation engineers on the consultant team.
Delia Levin, I'm a travel demand forecaster on the consultant team.
I'm Chris Bello, also on the consultant team, managing the ridership and traffic analysis.
Barry Gore, City of Rockville.
Darcy Buckley, MCDOT.
William Schuldner, MCDOT.
Steve Aldridge, Park and Planning. Walker Freer, Park and Planning.
All right, thanks, Brown. Okay, so in terms of the format for our meeting this evening, Corey is going to be giving a presentation to, again, just give you kind of an update on what we've been working on. And then we will just have a facilitated discussion to get your input on what you heard, see if you have any questions, things like that. The presentation takes probably about 40 minutes if we don't stop at all for questions. And there's really a lot in there and a lot to get through. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you think of questions while Corey is presenting, please feel free to write them down. You've all got the handout, that's sort of your cheat sheet about the alternatives, that's blank on the back, so that's a great place to write them down. And there's a lot of cases where Corey will probably answer your question in the next slide too, so there's, like I said, there's a lot there. So yeah, that's our format for this evening. And then we'll wrap up at 8 o'clock, but if you still have questions that haven't been answered, just we're happy to stick around for a few more minutes to make sure you get them answered. So, any questions about our format? Okay, go ahead.
Flip, I think the left switch will turn the lights off towards the front. We'll have to turn all of them up.
That good?
The one, or the other one. Put the other one back on. There we go.
Okay. There we go.
All right, well, welcome. I'll try and get through this as quickly as we can so that we can get to the question and answer period, because I think that's what most people are interested in. Generally, the overview, we're going to give an overview of where we are, alternatives, get into the summary of results, which I think is what most people are interested in, and then move on to discussion. So I think everyone knows the project is to identify a recommended alternative for BRT on Maryland 355. From Bethesda to Clarksburg. That's a 22-mile long corridor, roughly. There's been a lot of planning efforts that have preceded this stage of the project, going all the way back to 2011 and even earlier. So all these documents have definitely have built upon that work and point towards it. The project purpose is to provide a new transit service with greater travel speed and frequency along ND 355 between Bethesda and Clarksburg that will help accomplish a number of goals and objectives, trying to improve connectivity and multimodal integration, improve bus mobility, address both current and future ridership demands, attract new riders while also improving the service for our existing riders, supporting master plan growth, improve transit access to major employment and activity centers, achieving the master planned non-auto driver mode share, obviously being sustainable and cost effective, and improving safety. The timeline, so going back to 2011, you can see the various points where things have occurred. This phase of the study we're calling phase 2, really picked right up where phase 1 ended in early 2017. We hope to wrap this up this summer, and then the plan is to move into phase design and implementation as soon as we receive additional funding. In terms of kind of drilling in on that process, we're really still kind of early on in the actual project design process. So we're in what DOT calls our facility planning phase 1. That's really conceptual engineering. We study various alternatives, we identify a purpose and need, and ultimately the conclusion of phase 1 is to arrive at a recommended alternative. And once we've done that and have funding available, we would move into phase 2, which is really getting into more preliminary engineering, starting to drill in on the impacts, better understand our right-of-way needs, environmental assessments, final concepts, and then ultimately come out with a detailed scope, schedule, and cost estimate for final design and ultimately construction. And throughout all of these processes, we'd be touching base with the corridor advisory committees, collecting public input, reaching out to our stakeholders. In terms of kind of where we are in this project, there's still a couple of steps left, but we're at the CAC point in the schedule. We'll have briefings for the city of Gaithersburg, as well as the city of Rockville, and mayor and councils before we go out to the public open houses later this month. Once we've wrapped up those, we'll do a briefing for the planning board in mid-July. We'll be collecting public comments through that period, and then the plan is in late July to go to the T&E committee and ultimately council, where a recommended alternative would be ultimately adopted. In terms of the questions that we're trying to answer at MCDOT, and this is with the help from our stakeholders, our CAC members, and the community at large, is what is the preferred alternative by segment or segments? What is the northern alignment? How might we phase the projects, or how might we segment those 22 miles into particular projects that we would then implement? And ultimately, what are the station locations? In case I reference specific segments, this is how we've segmented the corridor, and this was really driven back on the previous phase of the project. And it's based on the roadway characteristics. This is more of a design relationship. It's not necessarily tied to ridership specifics or other operational considerations. It's really as the roadway changes, so do the design considerations. But if I happen to reference a segment number, these are those segments. Getting into the alternatives, so our no-build alternative is essentially the service that's out on the street today. Montgomery County doesn't have a long-range transit plan for our bus service. We tend to make adjustments year by year, so this is the best prediction on what the service would be in the future as of today. And that would include our Ride on Extra service. The TSM approach, or kind of a more operations-focused approach, would be the extension of the Ride on Extra service south to Bethesda and north to Clarksburg. With that extension would come an extension of the transit signal priority. There'd be some added stops, and we would convert the service from a peak period service to an all-day service.
Where in Clarksburg would it end?
The outlets. Our alternative A is our Q-jump and mixed traffic alternative. So the flash service would operate in mixed traffic. We have identified 20 locations where we could implement Q-jumps to help the bus get around congestion at specific intersections. There would of course be additional TSP. This is where we would get into the upgraded BRT stations that would provide off-board fare collection and level boarding. And we would get into the flash branding, so we would have the articulated vehicles in a more BRT-oriented service. Our median alternative, or alternative B, would be a flash service in dedicated median lanes where feasible. This doesn't mean that we would have dual median lanes throughout all 22 miles. There are just some sections of the corridor that are too constrained to try and fit those in. There would be additional TSP, the upgraded stations, and the flash vehicles and branding. We did look at what we're calling a median alternative modified, or a B modified. Again, this is flash service in median lanes where feasible. The only distinction is that for segments 4, 5, and 6, this is essentially north of Rockville from Montgomery College. we would have just a single reversible peak direction dedicated lane. So this is an effort to try and skinny down the impacts along the corridor, reduce the costs. So we looked at a configuration that would facilitate that while also still keeping the stations in the center. So we've come up with a design that will allow us to keep the stations concentrated so that you don't need multiple stations for mixed traffic or median operations, while also keeping the footprint of the project compact. Our curb alternative, or alternative C, would be a flash service in curb running lanes. Those lanes would be dedicated for the BRT as well as for local bus service. It would facilitate right turns at intersections or access into driveways. There would be queue jumps as part of this alternative, additional TSP, upgraded stations, and the flash vehicles. If anyone recalls from the last time we met, we do have some differences in segment 7 with the northern alignment. This is really north of Middlebrook Road and then continuing on to the Clarksburg outlets where the route terminates. The 3 alignments would be 1, keeping the route on Maryland 355, but this alignment assumes that MDOT SHA would widen the road to a 4-lane cross section. Once you get north of Ridge Road, the road is really 2 lanes. It's very rural. The land uses are really not conducive to operating high-frequency, high-quality transit service, so that would be kind of a trigger before we might consider adding that service. Observation Drive, which is the darker orange line on the right-hand, on your right-hand side of the screen if you're facing, or I'm sorry, left-hand side of the screen if you're facing the screen, assumes a future extension by MCDOT. The road is not currently constructed all the way to Clarksburg. That construction would need to occur before the BRT would operate on that alignment because we don't want to burden the BRT project with the extension of the roadway. The Snowden Farm Parkway alignment was actually an alignment that was added as part of this phase of the project. It's the lighter orange line on the right-hand side of the screen. It's the only alignment that doesn't require either an extension of an existing road or the widening of an existing road. And really, it is the current center of Clarksburg. That's where all the residential and commercial development currently lies. Now, just because we have 3 alignments here and we're trying to settle on one as part of an initial build doesn't mean that in a future condition, if the roadways either were to get extended or widened, that we couldn't consider these other alignments as part of a future condition. It just means that we're trying to settle on one at this ultimate time. Focusing in briefly on operations. So we did look at how we might operate the BRT service. So we've identified 4 route patterns that would comprise the full length of the corridor, and this was based on looking at ridership patterns, travel patterns both current and future, transfers, other constraints both operational and physical. So the 4 patterns are 2 northern patterns. One would start at Clarksburg outlets and terminate at Montgomery College in Rockville. The other alignment would start at Germantown Transit Center and terminate at Montgomery College Rockville. So those 2 routes would overlap for a portion of the corridor. The darker blue line would operate from Lake Forest Transit Center to Grosvenor Metro, and then the green line would cover the southern portion of the corridor from Montgomery College Rockville to Bethesda. So each of these service patterns, each of these four would individually operate every 10 minutes. So when you start to overlay them with each other, you get some pretty good effective headway. So at the tails, you still have 10-minute frequency, but in the core of the corridor, you have anywhere from 5 to 3.5 minutes.
Is this, how many hours a day is a 10-minute service?
And the 10-minute service would be from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m.
So even though Montgomery County is recommending that we reduce the service on the Route 355 from every 15 minutes to every 20 minutes, you think somehow we need 10 minutes on the express bus versus the local bus?
So I'm not going to handle a whole lot of questions so that we can get through the presentation, but based on the demand that we're seeing, we feel that these service patterns are warranted. Drilling in on stations, so we've looked at stations a little bit further than the last study did. We applied a 2-level screening process. The first level of the screening we actually did with you guys back the last time we met, and we were really asking the question, does this location make sense for a station? Fairly simple, yes or no question, but we based it on ridership, land use, connections to to other transit as well as ped and bike, and looking at the street network and feedback from the community that we received at the time that we were doing this. If the question was yes, those stations then moved on to the level 2 screening, where we're actually physically trying to site the station at a particular location at the intersection. So this was a more engineering-oriented exercise, looking at geometry, site constraints, whether the station should be near side or far side. And out of that selection process, there were 3 levels of stations. Some stations were recommended not to be considered further, and I'll touch on those in the coming slides. Some stations were recommended to be initial stations, so those would be part of the initial project. And then there were some stations that were identified as infill stations or future stations, recognizing that perhaps land use might not be conducive for a BRT station at this date, but future plans call for intensification of land use, and at that time, it might make sense to add a station, and we can put it on the plan so that as a developer comes forward, we can make sure to set that space aside. So going through the stations briefly, these are each of the distinct alignments in segment 7, so I've broken them out by each alignment. This is the Maryland 355 alignment. Again, starting at Clarksburg Outlets, and the segment 7 ends at Middlebrook Road. This would be the Observation Drive alignment, if that alignment were ever to be fully extended up to Clarksburg. And then the Snowden Farm Parkway alignment. And then these are the remaining stations for segments 6 through 1. So starting from Middlebrook Road and moving south to the Bethesda Metro Station, future second entrance. We've highlighted the station locations that fall both within the city of Gaithersburg and city of Rockville, and you can also see the distinction for those stations that have been identified as infill. So how are we evaluating the alternatives? That's what everyone wants to know. That's the big question. So we have 4 kind of overarching goals that were set at the beginning of the project with the help of the community and our stakeholders. And then within each of those goals, we have a number of metrics focused on specific aspects that relate back to that goal, from reducing travel times, to improving transit service to existing and planned developments, to minimizing environmental and cultural impacts. So I'm going to start transitioning from kind of talking about alternatives and stations into actual results and how these relate back to the goals and objectives of the project. So one of the first objectives was to increase transit ridership. And what we find is through the modeling efforts that all 3 of the build alternatives perform better than the TSM alternative. And in fact, the median alternative for alternative B is nearly double the no-build condition. And you'll notice the distinction. The green color is the local bus service ridership, and the darker blue is the BRT ridership. We would expect to see that as you layer in a higher quality service, that there would be some transition of ridership from the lower quality local service to the new BRT service. And we also found that we have minimal impact on Metro Rail ridership. Drilling in a little bit further on the ridership results, so we found that over 50% of the daily riders occurred in the off-peak, and this was regardless of alternative. And that's really a testimony to the fact that if you start providing a higher quality service in the off-peak periods, people will start to use it. That's what we found in other corridors as well. We do find that the projects attract roughly 9,000 new daily transit riders, and the distinction there is that these were people that were traveling the corridor previously and not using transit. So these are new transit riders, not people that have shifted from, say, another transit mode. Looking at the segments themselves, so we find the highest ridership kind of concentrated in 3 segments: the White Flint segment, which is segment 2, the Shady Grove segment, which is kind of the North Rockville and Southern Gaithersburg segment 5, and then the Gaithersburg Core segment, which is segment 4, and then Gaithersburg Core, which is segment 5. Drilling in a little bit further, looking in at specific stations, we tend to find fairly high ridership at the metro station, so that's pointing to the linkage, especially for people traveling from the north and then transferring to the metro stations. The only exceptions are at the medical center station and Grosvenor. We didn't see high ridership for the BRT at those particular stations. We also saw a high ridership at Lake Forest Transit Center, which is why we made sure to provide the connection to the existing transit center. Montgomery College, Rockville, and in the Watkins Mill Road area. When we look at segment 7, we thought that we might see some distinction between the various alignments, and that might inform a decision on which alignment. But really, at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot of distinction between the three, so it's not likely to be a driving factor as to deciding which alignment in segment 7. We did look at park and ride and how that might support a future BRT. We could see a range of ridership results tied to BRT and park and ride. We looked at 3 primary locations, not that were tied to a specific site at those locations, but we kind of turned on the park and ride aspect in the model and said, how would a park and ride perform, so that we might know whether we should start looking at sites in the future. So 50% of the boardings at Lake Forest Transit Center were tied to park and ride, and then 20% both at Clarksburg and Milestone. So what that tells us is that in future phases of the project, we need to start thinking about where we might set aside space for park and ride facilities or expand our existing facilities. Another objective was to make the bus trips faster and more competitive, and what we find is that both alternatives B and C do perform better in terms of travel time savings compared to all 3 of the no-build, TSM, and alternative A. So giving some level of dedicated guideway did provide a noticeable travel time savings, especially when you compare it to the existing trip in the corridor at 72 minutes in the morning southbound. I will note there is a kind of an ancillary benefit to alternative C, because the local buses get to use that lane as well, and they also saw some travel time savings compared to the other alternatives, so that's just something to keep in mind as we're trying to identify an alternative. And then the off-peak travel times were fairly consistent across the build alternatives, so this doesn't necessarily point to that in the off-peak direction you might need full dedicated guideway, and supports the reversible condition that we might consider. We also looked at reliability along the corridor. This is something we hear a lot about. People want a trip that they can count on consistently day in and day out. So looking at the existing transit service that operates in the corridor, the reliability factors are really not that great. 77.6 in the Metro bus, and anywhere from 71 to 74% on the ride-on service. So if we can improve upon that, I think that's an improvement for both our existing riders and anyone that might consider taking the service in the future. But it's important to note that reliability can be impacted by a number of factors. It's not just the volume of traffic in the corridor that impacts reliability, but it's bottlenecks, traffic fluctuations, incidents. Everyone knows that if there's an incident, a big incident on I-270, that diverts traffic onto Maryland 355. If there's an incident on 355, it has impacts. Work zones, weather, and special events. So in the model, we picked a point in the model and watched and noted every time that a BRT vehicle passed that point. And what we found is that generally the alternative B, or the median alternative, showed better reliability in what I'm calling normal conditions. And this is what we modeled, which is kind of the average condition. It doesn't account for what happens when a traffic incident occurs on the corridor. It doesn't account for bad weather events. It's trying to model kind of a typical day, if you could say that there is a typical day on Maryland 355. So trying to capture, okay, what is the effect of, say, the atypical day on the corridor? We looked at travel speeds for 2018 using INRIX data. So this is actual data that's pulled from vehicles traveling in the corridor. The dark blue line that you see in the middle is the average travel time. That roughly accounts to what we've attempted to model. That's what happens if everything performs how we expect it to perform. The buffers that you see on either side are what happens to that travel time when incidents occur, when variability in performance along the corridor happens. So that can range anywhere from 8 to 21 minutes. It's kind of like when you punch in a destination in Google Maps and say, I want to arrive by 7 p.m. and it says, well, you need to leave anywhere from 20 to 50 minutes. It's accounting for that variability in the corridor. So the wider the variability, we know we're trying to control that if we're trying to make the trip reliable. Similarly, if we look at the evening commute, it's roughly the same, anywhere from 11 additional 21 minutes. of planning time that you need to account if you want to arrive on time. So what this starts to tell us is that perhaps alternative B would perform more consistently in line with the average travel time because it's physically separated from the traffic. So if there is an incident in the general purpose lanes, the BRT is not impacted by that incident as greatly as, say, the curb lane or the mixed traffic alternative. We're trying to make bus trips faster and more competitive. So we all often get the question, well, how does this relate to driving? If I currently drive, how will the BRT improve my trip? So looking at the no-build auto drive time, it varies depending on direction and which peak period, but it's anywhere from 12 to 30% faster, and it's usually faster in the off-peak direction. The peak direction, the BRT is starting to compete a little bit better. Again, these figures don't account for non-recurring congestion. This is, again, modeled results, so this is kind of the average condition or the typical condition. So we would expect these results to get a little bit worse for the driver in a non-recurring congestion event. So just as an example, if we were to layer in that planning time on the no-build drive time, your trip starts to get pretty close to that alternative B travel time. So again, something to consider is that the ability to provide for a more reliable trip is one of the aspects.
Who in their right mind, if you live in Tuckerman Lane, which I live right by Tuckerman Lane, I'm going up to Middlebrook.
Jerry, it's just an example.
We're gonna get to questions, I promise.
Okay, it just makes no sense why I wouldn't drive in the morning when you gotta watch out for cops giving out tickets on 270 because they move so fast.
So there are other aspects that don't get captured in the model compared to travel time and reliability. These are softer impacts. There are cost savings for people who choose to use transit if it's competitive for them compared to driving. There are increases in traffic safety. It's actually safer to ride the bus, much like flying, than it is to drive in your own vehicle or ride with someone else. There are health benefits that are associated with using transit. You get to use that time on the vehicle productively. If you're traveling 30 minutes while you drive, we hope that you're spending those 30 minutes focused on driving and not focused on other things. If you're spending a 40-minute bus trip, you get to use that 40 minutes however you wish, whether that's to start doing work, whether that's to start catching up on a book, podcast, whatever. And then there are also environmental benefits that support the county's goals. In general, we find that all the build alternatives increase accessibility to high-frequency transit for key demographic groups along the corridor. This was something that we expected to happen, but the results bore that out, so that was a good thing. We also saw that the improvements in travel speed resulted in greater access for transit users coming to the corridor as well as traveling from the corridor to activity centers and employment. So what this says is that if today you can travel, say, 30 miles in 30 minutes, with the BRT, you can travel slightly further in that same 30 minutes, so you can access more jobs. When we look at how we might balance the mobility needs of all users, so this is looking at how the BRT and traffic relate, we do find that most of the alternatives show a small increase in the miles of level of service E or F along the corridor. And these increases are generally associated with changes that we've made in the operations along the corridor. We're adding TSP, we're considering queue jumps, phase changes. These things have impacts to intersection operations that then have impacts on the corridor. Average person delay only increases a small amount, about half a minute or less. Again, this is average, so some people might experience a longer delay, some people might experience less, but half a minute added delay on average is not a huge number when you consider how long it takes to traverse the corridor currently. In the AM peak, if we start to look at intersections and drill in a little bit further, level of service remains relatively unchanged across all the build alternatives except for alternative B. This is because alternative B has the greatest impact to the intersections because we have to close the non-signalized intersections and that diverts traffic to the signalized intersections. In the PM peak, we see that LO to S, or level of service, degrades for both alternatives B and C. But when you look across the total delay that's currently along those intersections, it's a relatively small increase, anywhere from 8 to 10%. All intersections actually experience some localized reductions in delay. So while we saw some increases in delay at some intersections, we actually found some intersections perform better than they did in the no-build condition. And what we're considering at this stage is that we're looking at 4 different alternatives across 22 miles. It's very difficult to drill into each specific intersection and perform a very robust assessment of how we might adjust intersections and further improve on them. So once an alternative is selected, that gives us the opportunity to then drill into each intersection, perform a more robust analysis, and actually further refine what little impacts we're seeing at this stage of development. We obviously want to minimize environmental impacts, and BRT can help support that. It does result in a reduction of CO2 equivalent emissions across all 3 of the build alternatives compared to the TSM. Obviously, the no-build doesn't do anything in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. When we look at other environmental impacts, so streams, forests, wetlands, parks, floodplains, or endangered species, we find anywhere from no impact to a minimal impact. And just because we're saying minimal impact, those impacts can be further refined and assessed in upcoming stages of the project. Looking at cultural resources, so these would be architectural properties, archaeological sites, or hazardous materials. We do find that there are sites that will require additional assessment as part of a more robust environmental assessment. But when you think about 22 miles of corridor, the numbers aren't that large. And our initial findings are that the impacts would be de minimis or considered de minimis in terms of historic properties or architectural properties. We also want to minimize the impacts to private and public property. The conceptual design is designed to fit within the master plan right-of-way. I would make the distinction, though, that much of this right-of-way is not currently available. If you look at the graphic on the right, so this is the existing right-of-way is obviously less than the master plan right-of-way, and I would argue that this is kind of the condition we have now. We have some right-of-way that is available that goes out to the master plan right-of-way, but much of that property isn't, so we do have to show that as a property impact at this stage of design. Obviously, as properties would come before the planning board for development or redevelopment, the master plan right-of-way can be acquired, and then those property impacts would come off of our books because it would be shown as right-of-way at that time. So with the conceptual design, we have sought to reduce the right-of-way needs as much as possible at this kind of early stage. Really 5% design is really about where we're at this stage. We've looked at reducing buffers where necessary. We've reduced or adjusted lane widths. We've included retaining walls where we could absolutely avoid an impact to a property by showing that retaining wall. But the work will continue to reduce right-of-way as the design advances. This is kind of how the process is designed to work. I will note that all alternatives from TSM all the way to Alternative C require some degree of right-of-way beyond what currently exists, but only at certain locations. So this is not for all 22 miles. It's kind of by specific condition. Most of the right-of-way needs are partial and along the roadway frontage of properties along Maryland 355. And then you'll see the actual acreage of right-of-way that's needed for each of the alternatives. So alternative B, the dual lane median alternative, does require the most additional right-of-way, and the TSM requires the least. We also want to minimize the cost of our transportation services, and the BRT alternatives have a range of costs based on the infrastructure investment and the specific location along the corridor. When you compare our project to kind of other significant regional transportation projects, such as the Purple Line, Silver Line, and the proposed I-495, I-270 managed lanes, our cost per mile figures are much lower. And when you look at the annualized cost per rider, so this is taking the infrastructure investment and annualizing those costs and that investment along with the operational costs for the BRT, and then divide by the number of annual riders, the figures actually start to support or look to support the build alternatives. I will note that alternatives B and C produce higher benefits in terms of travel time savings and ridership and reliability than the other alternatives. And that right-of-way costs are a major contributor in specific segments of the corridor. Again, the master plan right-of-way is not available in most areas, and our design efforts would continue to reduce those right-of-way needs to try and lower that cost, as well as working with property owners as they come forward for redevelopment to try and reduce the right-of-way needs and project costs. These are the estimated capital costs by alternative, by segment. You'll note that some segments are more expensive to implement than others. Again, this relates to design constraints, right-of-way needs, utility impacts, and other sorts of considerations that need to be accounted for. And when you look at the annualized costs, the bottom line there, it shows the total annualized cost per rider. They're all kind of roughly in the same ballpark. And the alternative B modified actually comes pretty close to the mixed traffic alternative because it is carrying more riders. So I know we've gone through a lot of stuff. I'm going to quickly go through kind of just a quick summary, and then we can open things up to discussion and questions. So all of the build alternatives, A, B, and C, improve accessibility for key demographic groups, jobs, and activity centers. We did not find that the build alternative displayed a significant impact on traffic operations, and that they display minimal environmental and cultural impacts. All of the build alternatives, A, B, and C, do display higher ridership than both the TSM and the no-build, and the median alternative displays twice the no-build ridership. 50% of the ridership, or more than 50% of the ridership, comes in the off-peak periods. And when we look at Snowden Farm Parkway, it is the alignment that best supports the existing conditions, meaning it is the one that we could actually implement tomorrow if we wanted. It's the current center of activity in Clarksburg. It's the only alignment that can be implemented in the near term. But I will note that selecting Snowden Farm Parkway does not preclude the other alignments in the future if they were to mature. The median, or alternative B, and curb alternative C alternatives provide travel time savings over a local bus, TSM, and mixed traffic alternative, or alternative A. The median alternative also provides an advantage during more congested corridor conditions. This is that reliability discussion that we had earlier. The conceptual design does fit within the master plan right-of-way, but in most cases that's not currently available, and future design efforts will continue to reduce those right-of-way needs. The build alternatives have a range of costs. We touched on those based on the infrastructure investment and the location along the corridor. And when you start to annualize the capital and operating costs, it does provide a better comparison for alternatives and supports selecting a build alternative. So with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions and discussion.
I'd personally like to start off by saying that's a great presentation. Thank you very much. Very thorough, and certainly gets the project on a good footing in terms of what you all had studied, and certainly is in line with a lot of, obviously, what has gone before. So thank you, Corey. That was really, thank you. That was great. Thank you.
I believe the Whitefoot Master Plan strongly encourages developers to dedicate the right of way. Did you take that into account? Is that a factor, or did you assume that it would all have to be paid for?
So the right-of-way assessment is done based on what is available today. So if it hasn't been dedicated, we're showing it as a cost.
Right.
If it were to become dedicated, as I indicated, those costs would start to come down and we would start to show the right-of-way increase along the corridor. So it's kind of a timing question, you know, as more properties redevelop along the corridor and that right-of-way gets set aside. And it's not just in White Flint. Rockville has a master plan that shows a certain cross-section that we fit in as well, and they've got properties that are starting to redevelop and they're getting those set aside. I mean, you know, the longer this kind of goes, the more right-of-way would be available and wouldn't have to be a cost to the project. So it's kind of, you know, how quickly do we want to do this, or, you know, do we want to wait? So,
At what point, or is there a point that you see in the future in terms of potentially going for grants for through the process?
So the process that we've been following up to this point has assumed that we could go into a federal process. We haven't precluded that, so we've been doing an environmental assessment so that if we wanted to, if we determined that that was the best way to get the funding that we needed, we could just easily kind of roll into that process. So at this stage, kind of all options are open. We haven't kind of started to shut doors. That said, the federal process can be somewhat onerous and time-consuming as well, so that's, again, another consideration is, do we want to go through that effort and have all the qualifiers that kind of get tied to accepting federal funds, which we are doing on US 29, and I can tell you, I've got monthly calls with the feds, to talk through how the project's going, and, how is the money going, and all sorts of other things, and we've had to prepare all kinds of additional plans to satisfy needs associated with that we might not have otherwise done if we had just gone it our own. So just a consideration. Yes, sir.
You clearly have done a fair amount of work on ridership, and you have 2 ridership people sitting in the room. I still don't understand who it is that's actually riding. What types of trips are people taking on BRT? And how long are they? How close do they start and end to the right-of-way? What are we learning about the types of trips that we're modeling?
Sure. So it's a lot of different trips, and you guys can jump in and add whatever, but it's a lot of different trips. So in the northern segment of the corridor, where there's not currently high-quality transit service, we see people trying to connect to Shady Grove and then travel more broadly.
Makes a lot of sense.
Correct, yeah, this is what we'd expect, and the model generally supported that. So we see a lot of people get on the service, and then we see a lot of people get off at Shady Grove. I also mentioned Montgomery College as a destination. We saw a similar pattern of a lot of people riding in the north and getting off at Montgomery College, Rockville. So it's serving, kind of a commuter need as well as kind of a local need to getting people to an educational or an activity center. In the southern portion, it's a combination of things. It's people that are traveling longer distances and connecting to metro stations, but it's also people starting to travel to these new infill activity centers that the Metro Rail doesn't necessarily serve all too well. You've got to recognize that we see what's out on the street today. What we've modeled is a 2040 land use future, so that assumes land use intensification in White Flint, in Rockville, and based on other areas and plans that all of our area planners have developed. So it's a combination of both longer haul trips that then transfer to other modes to serve that trip into, say, DC or beyond, as well as shorter localized, more commercial oriented trips.
So what I'm hearing is a fair number of feeder trips to other transit modes, Metro Rail.
Yes.
And those can be longer north of where there's Metro Rail, and that makes a lot of sense. You have a fast way to get to Shady Grove. And presumably shorter when you are along the alignment?
Yeah, I would say the people that are probably traveling along the alignment are traveling shorter distances.
Okay, so there are these other trips that you referred to, the people who are taking medium-type trips. Are those people who live along the alignment, are going to work? Are they people who are going shopping? Do we have any idea what it is we're talking about? And why would they be taking this vehicle as opposed to a regular bus?
Because it's a faster trip. The predominant choice in making your trip determination is that the trip time is faster. So if the BRT can provide a faster trip than the local bus, people will choose the BRT over the local bus if they overlap and serve the same trip purpose.
And if the bus comes more frequently.
But that also says that you have to have a lot of bus stops. If I'm taking a short trip, I don't want to walk a mile and a half in order to get to my closest bus stop.
Unless the service is a higher frequency, and then we actually see that.
I'm not going to walk a mile and a half anyway.
That may be you, but predominantly what we find is that people are willing to walk a further distance for a higher level of service. And this mirrors Metro Rail.
But, I've done transportation planning for many, many years, And anything over 3/4 of a mile, the number drops close to zero. And anything over half a mile, the number is very low. And when you get within a 1/4 mile, now you got some substantial numbers of people who will walk to the service. So, you know, if you're talking about people taking long walks, that isn't gonna work. So the next question is, are they traveling by bus to get there? Is that part of your modeling?
The model assumed a local bus network
Mm-hmm.
that would connect into the BRT service. It assumes people arrive by walking, it assumes people arrive by park and ride, as we indicated, it assumes people arrive by biking. You know, they're arriving by a variety of modes, just like they currently do. We have bus services that connect to Metro Rail, and that's how people arrive to Metro Rail. Not everyone walks or drives to Metro Rail.
And the modeling tool that we use assumes that it's much easier and more attractive to walk that 1/4 distance that you talked about, and then has a longer walking distance that has less attractiveness.
Are you using transportation analysis zones for centroids?
Yes.
Where are the centroids compared to alignment?
Okay, this is,
It depends.
Uh-huh. Because that changes your numbers enormously.
It does to some extent.
To a very big extent. Wherever you locate the centroid tells you where the people are going to be, are theoretically being, and therefore how far they're walking or riding and how long it's going to take.
That is true, and we've done work up and down the corridor to try and locate both the centroid connectors appropriately based on what the actual local roadway network looks like, and to make sure that we're not biasing our results based on where the stops and the centroids are located.
Sometimes I'd like to look at those. Because
You'll have to ask Corey about that.
You can change the numbers enormously just by moving that centroid a little bit. And that also changes the type of rider you're getting. So one of the interesting things I keep looking for is
As
what
I
are we looking
mentioned
for?
earlier, we're gonna stick around afterwards, so Dahlia can
I
talk about
won't keep-
modeling all evening, she's
I
really
won't
good
keep
at that.
going. Okay.
Yeah.
When we look at the actual data for fiscal year 2019, we see we have an express bus known as the 101. It only has 16% of the ridership on 355. The local buses have 84% of the ridership on 355. And people keep telling me about southbound. I got the actual data of alignment on the express bus. Southbound at Lake Forest, 289 people get on board. At Shady Grove, 273 get on, while 109 get off. At the college, 116 get on, 143 get off. At Rockville, 164 get on, 170 get off. This ridership, what we're currently seeing, seems to have nothing to do with 2040. And by 2040, WMATA will shut down. There'll be no rail service into Washington, because most of it will be underwater twice a day at high tides.
Is there a question?
What?
Is there a question?
My question is, how come you're not looking at the real data and don't actually provide the real data to us in these things? If you're gonna make plans and we see we're getting so few ridership, the ridership on the express bus is currently 1,664 people for both ways. Why can't we see this data as part of the presentation or as part of the open house? I mean, there's a lot of good data available. We're just getting projections for 2040. Why don't you show us what the current data and how many people would prefer the local bus rather than the express bus?
Okay.
And my other question sort of come in, we see the county proposing right now, and I think it's going into effect, of reducing the headway, which is currently 15 minutes on the 55 bus. That's the one moved from Rockville north up to Lake Forest and beyond to the Germantown Transit Center. They're proposing reducing the thing from every 15 minutes
Jerry,
to every 20 minutes.
Jerry, that cut wasn't made, so that was put back into the budget.
But it's a proposal.
Jerry,
Obviously, there
can we
is
move
no
on and talk
budget.
about our presentation?
Are we
My
looking
question
at
is,
current
if we're gonna
ridership?
spend millions of dollars.
Ride-on isn't here tonight to discuss that, but, you know, but I think we're, you know.
If we're gonna spend hundreds of millions of dollars for this, mess up traffic, because currently we have over 250,000 people making left turns or U-turns, and if we're gonna put anything in the median, we're gonna block most of those left
Can we
turn and
respond to your
U-turns,
question?
which is gonna destroy all of the traffic on 355.
Okay.
And if anything,
I'm
we
sorry,
should-
I'm sorry, Jerry, but I'm not gonna let you take over the entire meeting. Other people are here who have things to
Okay.
say, who have
Well,
questions.
let's look at the real data.
Okay, well, we're welcome to continue this
So we-
conversation.
All the data will be available to everyone through the reports. There'll be multiple technical reports that will get released at the timing of the open house. We're compiling those now. We can't go through every intersection by intersection for every alternative for 22 miles in an hour-and-a-half meeting. That's just too much. For
But
some
you're not
people,
even showing us where the median bus route, where it's gonna be a curb. Are we losing lanes on?
actually,
Actually,
we
we are happy
did.
to
The sheets
show
that you have here in front of you, if you flip over the alternatives, show you where we're talking curb running and median running.
Okay.
And these alternatives have been in place since the beginning of the study last year.
Are there other questions or comments on what was in the presentation?
I did touch on the traffic results. We're not finding terrible traffic results. The impacts are relatively minor, even though you are shifting people from intersections that are currently open to intersections that will be closed in the future. In terms of the existing ridership that has been accounted for, it's accounted for in the modeling. It's accounted for when we looked at the route patterns that we identified. And I think it's a little disingenuous to point to an extra service that only operates in the peak period when the local service operates all day long and try and compare the ridership results as apples to apples. We would expect fewer riders to ride in a shorter period of time. And what we've actually seen is that the ridership has increased on the 101 consistently, and we've heard more people request that service to be extended beyond its existing time frame.
Well, over the 1 year period, it's increased by 64 riders a day, or 32 people more than it did a year ago, according to the data available from the
I don't
county
have
council.
the data in front of me, so it's
I'm
a
glad
little
you
hard
do.
for me, well, it's hard for me to respond to your questions pointing to data that you've manipulated and looked at.
Data is available on the county council. I'll give you the reference where the data is available.
Great.
Other questions, comments? I know at the beginning, Corey did mention kind of those types of information we'd love to get from you. Phasing priorities would be definitely something we'd love to hear your opinions on. If there's an alternative or an alignment in segment 7 that you have a strong preference for, we'd love that type of input as well.
And direct it to Corey?
You can direct it
To
to
the
me or Darcy. I think most people have Darcy's email address as well.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Evan?
I guess, when would the next CAC meeting, do you suggest, might you consider?
So it's kind of dependent on when the next phase of the project, we would expect that we would re-engage this group as part of a preliminary engineering phase. That's what we did on US 29. We actually got a lot of, I would say that was kind of where we got the most fruitful benefit from the CACs is tweaks to design, shifting station locations, you know, avoid this intersection, you know, consider this intersection. So we would re-engage the CACs at the next phase of the project once we enter in preliminary design.
And is that next phase funded now, or?
It's not currently funded. I think once we get to a recommended alternative and we know exactly what the project would be and perhaps have some indication of how we might phase it, so then we can, you know, the costs I showed you are the cost to do all 22 miles if we were to do it all at once. I think there's a recognition that that's a pretty sizable project for the county to undertake, both in terms of cost and just in terms of bandwidth. So I think we would likely do some subset of that. And once we have kind of that set, then we can go to council and say, this is what we think it would take to do the next phase of the project and request funds.
So it's a question of identifying perhaps that subset and then the financial commitment for that subset.
Yes.
So the council, the next budget cycle would be?
So we're in the process now of actually starting the next CIP update for the next 2-year cycle this summer, so that would come around next year. Now, that doesn't preclude supplementals. If the council is so inclined and wants to advance something faster than the CIP cycle, they have the ability to do a supplemental request if they can find the funding to do that. So it's possible that as soon as this fall, we could be starting if, you know, the impetus is there. Yes?
Looking at slide 44, the capital costs, why is the Whiteland segment, particularly alternative B, so much more expensive? It's like,
So a lot of it is the right-of-way costs, the
Right-of-way.
land values
okay.
we found were higher in White Flint.
How did you model right-of-way acquisition knowing that you're trying to design down around it? Is there some level of percentage you're kind of projecting, and is there a phasing for that, I imagine, as well, as far as what you think, how properties might develop or what might need to be acquired? Can you share some of that logic?
Sure, so in terms of the design, we had our design criteria, how wide a BRT lane is gonna be, what type of buffer or size buffer we would do, and how many lanes that we're designing for. So we kind of lay out that cross-section on the corridor. And then beyond it, we create what's called a limit of disturbance. So this accounts for kind of the unknowns at this kind of high level of design. So, slopes, we would have a larger limit of disturbance. There's construction easements and other things that would need to be acquired, those are captured in that. So based on that limit of disturbance, we identified the right-of-way that we think we will need, both permanent as well as temporary. And that's what we cost on. We do a clip of the properties and how much of the private properties we can tally up. That's what you're seeing, the tallies of those acreages, is that tabulation of that for the full corridor.
Additionally, segment 2 is the longest segment. So it's interesting, it looks freakishly more expensive because it is the longest segment, whereas they say segment 3 is really short. So it is the most expensive, probably from an infrastructure perspective and a right-of-way perspective, but it's also the longest. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison.
Thank you.
How many businesses do you think will go out of business between Tuckerman Lane and Dodge Street when you put a 2-lane median, basically prohibiting left turns, including Whole Foods? You think they'll go out of business and everything else along that way that people can't get to these locations?
Not necessarily. I mean, I can't say that.
How will someone get to Whole Foods if they're going northbound on 355?
They'll have to go to the next signalized intersection and do a U-turn.
Well,
And
where
they
will
do
that
this
be?
in many areas that have median running transit. You can find examples all across the country.
Well, we're talking about Rocco Pike, which is particularly a retail set of things between Tuckerman, well, a little bit north of Tuckerman Lane, up to Dodge Street. That's basically a retail area. We know that southbound, you get a backup when people try to make a U-turn because the Beltway doesn't allow you to go northbound on 355. So basically, all traffic comes to a halt southbound of the Beltway where the people want to make a U-turn because they can't make a U-turn in one light cycle going northbound. And I assume this will happen. It'll basically destroy all traffic on 355 once you put anything in the median. And I'm only talking about between Tuckerman Lane and Dodge Street. I'm pretty familiar with Tuckerman Lane since my bedroom window faces Tuckerman Lane, and I regularly use it. I would never dream of getting on a bus in Tuckerman Lane and going up to Clarksburg in the morning when it would take me about 15 minutes by car, and it'll probably take me an hour or an hour and a half by bus.
Is your question about the business impacts?
Yeah, what is the business impacts? How many businesses? I know the sales tax goes to the state, but the state will lose a huge amount of sales tax as each business goes out of business. If you can't get to the Target, if you can't get to all these other stores.
Jerry, please ask your question with an answer.
Well, how many businesses are gonna go out of business?
That's impossible to predict, to model, like, if you close down an intersection, how few.
How worse will traffic get in the 2 lanes that we have?
I've already talked about the traffic, and the traffic impacts were not that great with the
We did not, that was
We simulated, we did a full VisSim simulation of the traffic for all 22 miles. It's a very robust simulation.
Well, your simulation, I don't think is correct from my own observations.
We'll be happy to talk to you about
That's
the
fine.
simulation
That's
afterwards.
your opinion.
Did you model positive financial impact based on stations? I imagine developers with properties there would be pleased.
So we have taken a kind of a cursory look at the financial benefits, and we do see a premium that's assigned to transit. So we would expect properties to also incur a positive benefit from having the BRT there. And usually that's tied to the level of infrastructure investments. So, financiers are looking for permanence. That's why people for years talked about light rail. Light rail is permanent, you've embedded in the ground. So obviously, just doing a TSM alternative where we're just running buses, which we can route, from one day to the next off the corridor, is less permanent than, say, a medium BRT where we'd actually be putting a curb into the ground.
They see it as you got a captured market.
So I can say from the White Flint Partnership standpoint, the location of the BRT stations was very important in the development of the White Flint sector plan. I can say that where the locations are for the stations, everyone within the White Flint sector plan is within a 10-minute walk of a BRT station. And I can also say that GSA sees the BRT stations satisfy their requirement for LEED certification, so it opens the opportunity for government offices to be located in areas where there is a BRT station, and that satisfies it. So there's great opportunity with BRT and the center median and station locations.
Do you guys have any thoughts on the phasing priorities? It's a really long corridor, 22 miles long. There might be some thinking in the future about where it should be implemented first.
Well, clearly mine.
It's
done.
Clarksburg, right?
So, certainly the White Flint Partnership has been working on the White Flint sector plan segment for many, many years. So that's a priority for the partnership and the development of the sector, frankly.
Yeah.
So I personally believe that one of the keys for making this successful will be to have lots of people ride on whatever is the first segment.
Yeah.
And I really think the feeder segments from Clarksburg going towards Shady Grove, that's going to be the most successful segment compared to today. Not the largest ridership total, but the one that is going to get ridership quickly.
I'd say demand based on development at the time of projected opening. I mean, if White Flint's projected to have the most riders at the time of whenever those corridor stations would open, it would make the most sense to put it there. If we believe the northern section is from Clarksburg, because they have the current developed demand, to Shady Grove is the most, that here brings me to the point of having the first step be strongest makes the most sense, but depending on what has the demand based on projected development and when it would open, I think is probably the best way to look at that versus, what we hope is the most successful one.
Well, the key is a combination of the development and where are those people going?
Absolutely.
Which is why I got into the long discussion.
Absolutely.
We've now seen in the last week that the county executive and other county transportation people went to a meeting on Ollie, which is a self-driving small bus that is being actually built in Clarksburg. And is any consideration to having these small buses running every 5 minutes or every 3 minutes, basically almost continuously on 355, self-driving, so you have no cost of bus drivers or anything else, and this is basically a fixed route, which could easily be GPS. I mean, I know my car, if I had no red lights on 355, I could actually go on 355 and go in the self-driving mode.
So do we think about autonomous vehicles?
Well, they're gonna come, and by 2040, they'll definitely be here. I mean, we don't seem to be looking at what's gonna happen in the future. We keep saying that these are gonna be the traffic projections, and basically, I just bought a new car. It is basically self-driving on highways. If I could make every traffic light on 355 going northbound or southbound, it would be self-driving. It would keep me in a lane or keep me so far behind. All these vehicles are almost here. They don't have the last mile,
Okay.
but self-driving buses are here. Is Ollie one of the considerations to use so we'll have no bus drivers?
So Ollie's not a consideration because it's too small of a vehicle to serve the demand on the corridor, even at the frequencies that you're talking about, which would actually be unachievable.
It also maxes out at 12 miles an hour.
So what I would say that Ollie is a consideration to providing that first mile, last mile connection.
It would definitely be enough.
We are starting, Ride-On is starting to look at other service
that's me.
models. The Flex service is starting this summer, which would be a new service model that the county hasn't ever had, where It kind of operates like an Uber. You can order it within a zone, and it'll take you to another destination within that zone. So you could have flex services that are performed by an Ollie that would pick you up. You would call it on your phone. It would then tie you into, say, a Metro Rail or a BRT station. But I don't see the Ollie as a replacement for the BRT. Now, we have explored where the state of the practice is for larger autonomous transit vehicles. And what we found is that transit seems to be the lowest rung in terms of commercial application for automation. The focus is on private vehicles, as you indicated, you have one of them, and on commercial trucking. That's where people see the money in terms of automation. We definitely see a benefit in transit. FTA is looking at doing pilot studies for automation, and we would be happy to participate in one of those. And what I would envision is that when automated buses come, that allows us to change our design requirements, because now the lane widths can get a little bit narrower for the bus, because the automated driver doesn't need so much lane pavement in order to drive in the lane. So really that becomes a design change. It's not a service change. I don't think it changes the service patterns. It changes how we design the corridor.
But Ollie would work on Route 29 where the average ridership is only 5.9 people per vehicle.
Not at a 12-mile-an-hour speed when you've got drivers operating at 55 or 40 miles an hour in the northern portions.
29 in rush hour?
And at the northern portions, as you get north of the ICC, yes.
Any questions, comments? Okay. Well, I think we can wrap up then. As I mentioned earlier, we're happy to stick around if you have any outstanding questions that we didn't get too deep into. As Corey said earlier, we're also doing those open houses in 3 weeks, June 26th and 27th. We're going to be doing two. One in Bethesda and one in Gaithersburg. So we'd appreciate your help getting the word out about the open houses. We're really hoping we will be mailing people along the corridor, but we'd like to optimize our attendance.
Is it possible to get any of the background data before that meeting, or as soon as possible when you're going to have it released to send to the members of the CAC?
Once it's available for release, we'll let everyone know.
Okay.
If you could send out preferred language for those open houses, if we want to pass it along, that would be most helpful to kind of put it in our.
Did you get I sent it an email out last week or something? I'll resend it to you. I'll make sure you have it.
Perfect.
Oh, and for like news stuff, I can send you a blurb. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I will update it.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here this evening. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Okay, so, and she out loud, okay.
Francine, can you start fundraisers to be raising?
Want these back, right?
Yeah.
I like that.
I think you raise a lot of money.
I know, that was a great, seriously.
So that was the problem?
Yeah.
I like that a great deal.
Have an olive oil.
I mean, we'll basically pay for that segment of the